Well, good morning, everybody. Are you wide awake this morning? You glad to be here? Well, I want to welcome you to this Compass Europe conference. I really believe in Compass Europe. I promote it myself through our ministry. I recruit people to be here this weekend, and I've been looking forward to being with you on this time. Now, several years ago, I read what I felt like it was one of the best books I'd ever read on leadership. And it's hard to really find good books on leadership that are balanced, especially for a believer. And I found it actually in a collection of other books. And this book is unique because the title was actually the author's name. And this book, I've read it a lot of times. It's really excellent. I wish you could get a hold of it. It's just superb reading. It's available on Amazon or probably bookstores in your country. And I found it. The book is Nehemiah. And it happens to be, I've got a copy of it right here if you're interested. So we're going to be looking at this fascinating book. I think one of the best books ever written. Actually, it's been called the first book on leadership ever written. And I want us to take a look at it because every one of us here this weekend is a leader at some level in the home, in a school, in business, in a corporation, in education. We're leaders. And when we're learning something new, when we're learning a skill, it doesn't help to have an example to follow, a model that you can learn from. And so Nehemiah is a superb model from whom we can learn. And I know we've all seen leaders that have not done well in their work because leadership can really be difficult. Those of you in leadership positions can testify that it can be really exhausting and challenging. So you say, why would anyone bother with being a leader? Well, because it makes a difference. It really can affect what's happening. You'll go to a restaurant and the food is great. Go back 6 months later, it's awful. What changed? Probably leadership. Churches, businesses, all these are shaped by the leaders they have. Now, our theme for this series is, is the godly leader who gets things done. Because all of us have seen some leaders that were godly, real people of prayer, but if we were honest, they didn't really get much done. And on the other hand, we've seen some very effective leaders, but as we get to know them, we find out they're really not very godly. They're not the kind of people that we would want to model our time, our lives from. So by the end of our time together, I want you to feel like you know Nehemiah and that you're learning from him. And my aim is that each of these 3 days we have together, that you'll be able to identify some leadership principles or practices that you can improve in your own life. So that when we leave Budapest on Sunday, we will be more like Jesus because we're learning from one of his servants called Nehemiah. Now, I've been chatting with a bunch of you here, and some of you may think that, oh, Nehemiah, that's primarily for pastors and ministry leaders, people in full-time Christian service. But that's not true at all. I mean, remember, Nehemiah was not a priest. He was not in the ministry at any point in his life. He was a high-ranking civil servant. He was a government official. And actually, most of the material in this book does not relate to what we'd call in our secular, sacred, dichotomized world, spiritual things, but rather real-life issues, construction projects, rebuilding walls, putting things together, organizing people, job descriptions. So here's our plan. Today, we'll look at Nehemiah as a visionary, as a servant of God, And as a man, as Peter mentioned to us last night, a man who prayed much. And then tomorrow, we'll look at him as an organizer, a planner, a motivator, a hard worker, an all-around super competent guy. And then Sunday, we'll look at him as an overcomer who persevered in the face of overwhelming obstacles, but God gave him power. Well, let's start by taking a brief look at Nehemiah's context and who he was. And I really appreciated Peter's message last night because you got pretty thoroughly acquainted with the wall, didn't you? Well, that's kind of what we're dealing with this week. Thank you, Peter, for that good message. So here's what we know about Nehemiah. He lived in difficult times because, as Peter mentioned last night, in 586, long before Nehemiah's story begins, 140 years, Jerusalem had been destroyed, totally wiped out. When I was in Jerusalem many years ago, they told us something like Jerusalem has been totally razed, I think 5 times, and partially razed like 35 times. And I appreciated Peter's reminding us that the foundations remained the whole time. So Jerusalem had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar well before Nehemiah's lifetime. And so Nehemiah's family's homeland had been destroyed. Now, that would be during probably his great-great-grandparents' time. So we've gone 3 to 4 generations now, and Nehemiah has likely never been to Jerusalem. His parents weren't, his grandparents weren't, his great-grandparents weren't. Probably his great-great-grandparents were the ones that came. So this has been a long time ago. He is well situated in the empire of Babylonia. So what is he doing there? Well, it's interesting, as Peter mentioned, some Jews were permitted to go back. You know the story well, but just as a reminder, some went back with Zerubbabel in 538, and then more returned in 458 with Ezra, just 14 years before we pick up with Nehemiah here. So it's a fascinating era. So let's start. One part of Bible study is, this is revolutionary, but reading the Bible. So let's start by reading chapter 1. And I would encourage you each day to bring your Bibles, keep them open, because we're going to be working our way through, especially the first six chapters. But let's begin with chapter 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days, I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. I said, "Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are out at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. Let me move over here so I can see which screen you're seeing here. Make sure I'm staying in coordination here. Thank you. So who was Nehemiah? Well, for starters, he was a Jewish refugee, as we've already talked, born and raised in exile in Babylon, like 3 to 4 generations of his family before him. Babylon was the only home he had ever known. And he rose to a high position in this pagan kingdom. Now, we know he was a modest man. I like that about him, because it's only at the end of chapter 1 that he quietly says, and I was cupbearer to the king. Now, this would be like me talking to you several minutes, telling you some story, and then adding as an aside, oh, by the way, I've been vice president of the United States for several years. I mean, it's like, especially Americans, braggadocious Americans always lead off with their credentials and all the great things they've done. Nehemiah goes all the way through this chapter. Oh, by the way, I was cupbearer to the king. Now, it just happens that the cupbearer was one of the highest, most trusted officials in the whole kingdom. Now, when I was a kid and I'd read this, I thought cupbearer, oh, that's like a waiter at a restaurant. Isn't that nice? He brings the king his cup. That's so pretty. That is nice. He was a nice servant guy. I thought it was like a butler maybe, or a servant. Well, nothing could be more wrong, because the cupbearer was one of the most important positions in the king. Actually, many commentators say it's more like a prime minister, even more powerful than a commander in chief, almost like second in power. So Nehemiah was definitely not the waiter that brings your coffee after your meal. You can be sure he lived in luxury, famous, no doubt, well-dressed, with access not only to the king, but the rich and powerful, some of the most powerful people in the world. So I think we need to listen to this guy and learn from him. So what do we learn from him? We learn, first off, that godly leaders are concerned about others. Now here's Nehemiah working away, doing his job. His brother Hanani shows up. His brother had been traveling, just returned from Jerusalem. So Nehemiah asks him, hey, dude, how's it going, bro? It's good to see you again. How was your trip? How'd it go? Tell me about how things are back in Jerusalem. How's Jerusalem doing? How's the people there doing? Again, as far as we know, Nehemiah had never been to Jerusalem. And actually, his brother may be the first person he's ever talked to that's been in Jerusalem. We don't know. But this meeting occurs around November or December of 445 BC. And Nehemiah is living the good life. You talk about financial discipleship. He was being paid really well, highly influential, respected, working with the movers and the shakers. And it would have been totally understandable if he would have responded to his brother and what he told him. Well, what do I care about what's happening in Jerusalem. God's given me a wonderful life here. I'm making lots of money. I'm very comfortable. God gave me this job, actually. God gave me this job. And so I'm going to stay focused on this. And I'm enjoying it. And I sure enjoy the money. I'm rich. I'm famous. I'm not going to do anything to mess that up. But none of that stopped his concern for his kin in Jerusalem. So here's the lesson. Godly leaders are not focused on themselves in their own work, but on others. In particular, they have a global concern for God's people and God's work. Let me encourage you, brothers and sisters, and I think the fact that you're here tells me you wouldn't do this, but do not get too comfortable in any position you arrive at. Regardless of how high you rise, how much money you make, never get self-focused. Nehemiah wanted to know what was happening in Jerusalem. Now, how do we show when we're concerned about something? Well, one way is we ask questions and then we take the time to listen. Good leaders are always good at asking questions, and good leaders take the time to listen. Now, each day this weekend, we're going to see several characteristics of a godly, effective leader who gets things done. And with each characteristic, I'm going to give you a question to ponder. Then at the end of each morning together, we'll have 15 or more minutes to discuss around our tables about some of these questions. So here's a question for you to ponder. What evidence is there in your conversations that you care about others? And what are some good questions? A friend of mine, Bob Beal, wrote a whole book on great questions to ask people, one of my favorite books. And what would help you to be a better listener? What else do we learn about leadership from Nehemiah? Well, as Peter reminded us, godly leaders pray often and earnestly. His repeated spontaneous prayers throughout this book are amazing. I love it because prayer was as much a part of his language as anything else. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed. Warren Wiersbe said, he cared enough to ask, he cared enough to listen, he cared enough to weep, he cared enough to pray, he cared enough to volunteer. Do you care enough? The first priority of a godly leader is to pray. Nehemiah cared deeply, so deeply, he took time to pray. Now, he prayed an amazing prayer. And it's interesting to me, I use this acrostic often in my own prayer times. My wife tells me I'm ADHD, somewhere on the Asperger scale with emphasis on that first syllable. But I'm ADHD, so it's sometimes a struggle for me to focus on prayer. So I use this acrostic, ACTS. It works in English, sorry. So A, adoration. C, confession. T, thanksgiving. S, supplication. And that's exactly the pattern, amazingly enough, that Nehemiah follows. He worshiped. He knew God's character. He knew scripture. He quoted Deuteronomy 9:29. He revered God's name. He confessed his sins and the sins of his people. He thanked God for redeeming them. And then he was interceding. He was making supplication for them. And we see this pattern all the way through the book of Nehemiah. Every time he hits a problem and every time there's a success, we see Nehemiah praying. So 12 more times throughout this book, we have his recorded prayers. Prayer, in other words, was a habit for him. James Montgomery Boyce, one of my favorite commentaries on Nehemiah, says, Nehemiah was a man who prayed frequently about everything. Prayer was a habit for him. And he said, great leaders are great prayer warriors. And may it be said of Compass Europe that every leader of Compass Europe is a prayer warrior. J.I. Packer, another great commentary in the book of Nehemiah, said, Nehemiah's public life was the outflow of his personal life, and his personal life was steeped in and shaped by habitual petitionary prayer. Years ago, I heard Joe Bailey, who was leading a Christian publishing company, said, when we work. But when we pray, God works. Question to ponder. What do you need to be praying about more earnestly today? And how often do you pray for believers outside your own circle? My wife and I have morning devotions together each day in the morning and also in the evening. And we regularly pray across Europe and around the world for our brothers and sisters that are facing crises. Well, let's read Nehemiah 2, verses 1 through 9. In the month of Nisan and the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, oh, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Oh, why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it that you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. There he goes again, praying. And I answered the king, if it pleases the king, sir, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asa, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me the timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king also sent army officers and cavalry with me. I love this one because we see that godly leaders act decisively. Now, you notice when Nehemiah learned the need in Jerusalem, his response was, here am I, send me. He didn't pray that the Lord would send somebody else. He didn't complain about the need for somebody needs to do something. He didn't excuse himself. Well, it's too bad. I've got such a great job and such an important job, so obviously I can't go. He didn't excuse himself or have false humility to say, oh, it's too bad I'm not equipped to do this work. That's a favorite among Christians, false humility. No, he stepped up and acted. So let me ask you, what action do you need to take now? What is it you've been stalling, postponing, but you need to act decisively? I've been in ministry leadership for 51 years, and every effective leader I've ever seen has been a decisive person of action. No excuses, no whining, no complaining, action. Next, godly leaders are willing to take risks. Now, it's now when he speaks to the king around March, April, 4 to 5 months since he heard the bad news. So this conviction had been growing on him that he was not only to pray for Jerusalem, but he was to do something about it. Now, you know well, you've heard the story many times. the king could have anyone who displeased him in the slightest executed without trial immediately. So even to mention Jerusalem was risky, much less asking for a lengthy leave of absence to go there and work. Remember, Nehemiah's boss was the same Artaxerxes who just a few years before, we know from scripture, had ordered that the rebuilding of the wall be stopped. It's the same man. He stopped the wall because the people in the area were threatened by it. And now the situation's even worse because there's several potential invaders in the area and things are even more tense than they were. But timing is all off, is all wrong. But Nehemiah risked his life, his job, his wealth, his reputation, his comfort, everything. Let me ask you this. What risk do you need to take right now? Is there a risk that you need to make a decision today, even while you're here at this conference? Act decisively and take the risk when you know God is directing. Next, we see, very interesting, I love this point, godly leaders are tactful, at least this one is. So notice that while Nehemiah took a risk, he is also wise in how he asked the king. I mean, first we notice that Nehemiah didn't just announce, well, God's called me, and I'm quitting my job here, and I'm moving to Jerusalem. No, he was a man under authority. In this case, the most powerful ruler in the world. He recognized wisely that whatever he did, he really needed the king's permission and he needed the king's help. A man under authority. Would that describe you? The best leaders I know are the best followers. The best leaders know what it is to be under the authority of someone else. I'm always leery of pastors and Christian leaders in any realm who act like they can just do whatever they want. God's their boss. Godly leaders recognize that they're not only under the authority of Christ, but they're under the authority of those over them. Now, when the king asked him what was bothering him, Nehemiah communicated the need succinctly and clearly. And he tells the king what's troubling him. But how he does it is a masterpiece in tact and diplomacy. First of all, he showed loyalty. He wasn't trying to outshine his boss or make him look bad. What's his immediate response? May the king live forever. It's like, I serve you, sir. That's where I start. So loyalty, but tact. He could have answered the king's question sarcastically, putting it back to his earlier ruling not to rebuild the wall. If he would have made a comment about the king's past ruling, how positive do you think the king would have responded? When I see this, I think of Proverbs 22:10. One who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend. And we start to see why Nehemiah got this job in the first place. Now, significantly, in this whole exchange with the king, Nehemiah never mentions Jerusalem by name. He was diplomatic in not mentioning the name of Jerusalem because the king had decreed negatively about Jerusalem. It had been a sore topic for the king in the past. It was controversial. Now, Nehemiah is not being deceitful. He's simply being wise in not referring directly to a potentially explosive issue. In other words, Nehemiah was gracious. He did not presume. He did not make demands, even though we know how strongly he felt. He didn't make it a political issue, but it was a personal issue. He referred to Jerusalem as the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried. Now that is diplomacy. That is wisdom. But there's honesty. Now to us, the readers, he admits, I was afraid. But to the king, he's very direct. I want to rebuild the walls. There's no bouncing around this. Well, I've been thinking this. I'm not sure, but those walls over there, I'm not sure. No, he was direct. He was honest. Don't surprise your boss or your board ever. No surprises. They don't work well in organizational life. Be honest and transparent. And of course, we see prayer. When the king asked him, he immediately breathed the prayer because it was a dangerous moment, could go either direction. And he had a clear plan, clear goal, clear achievable plan. He had dependence on God. I got to tell you, in 51 years, I've seen a lot of leaders that are brash and demanding. Now you think of how strongly Nehemiah felt this. He could have easily chosen this as a time to criticize the king for stopping the wall a few years earlier, and it would have been justifiable. He could have talked about the king's bad judgment, but he didn't. He stated the need in a way the king could hear him. Great leaders understand their audience, and they speak in a way their audience can understand and respond. Again, this doesn't mean we compromise truth, but it does mean we want to communicate the truth in a way our audience will understand and respond. So Nehemiah wasn't brash in making a big announcement. Instead, he invited the king to consider it. He said, if it please the king, this is gentle, this is loyalty and tact at its best. Now, it's clear from the record that Nehemiah had done a really good job for this king. He had done his work with excellence. Otherwise, he never would have been given this years-long leave of absence. And so again, I think of Proverbs 22:29. Do you see those who are skilled in their work? They will serve before kings. So what is one situation that you need to handle right now with tact and diplomacy? Is there some problem within your organization or your family or your home that you need to handle with gentleness? Well, next we see that godly leaders give credit to God and others, not to themselves. I love verse 8. Because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my request. Those are beautiful words. Nehemiah didn't claim, it was because I submitted this great proposal. Though he did. He didn't say, well, the king approved because I'm such a great worker. Though he was. He didn't say, I did such a great job of presenting the need to the king. He had to grant my request. Though he did a great job. And we've all seen leaders, we've worked with leaders who gladly grab the credit for everything good that happens. But the godly, effective leader is modest and gives the credit to God and to others. One of my favorite writers on business and management leadership is Jim Collins. He happens to be a believer himself. And in his best-selling book, Good to Great, he studied the top, he calls them level 5 executives. He said a level 5 executive is an individual who blends extreme personal humility with intense personal will. He said these level 5 are studying duality. They're modest and willful, humble and fearless. Let me ask you a question. Who deserves the credit for the successes you have had? for what you have accomplished. And are you giving them that credit? Are you passing that along? Now, just a side observation here in closing. Nehemiah has proven his ability to lead by his service to the king. It's my observation, God always calls people who are already serving where they are. He never calls people who are passive and lazy and doing nothing. He always calls people from current activity. So let me ask you, do you want to be a godly leader who gets things done? Well, here's a place to start. Express concern for others by asking good questions and taking time to listen. Pray often and earnestly. That's the bedrock of everything we do. Act. Do something. Some Christians I know are always talking about what they're going to do out there in the future, and they never quite get there. Act. Do it. Be willing to take risk. Many of us here today can testify we've had times when we had to jump off the cliff because we knew God was calling us to obedience. And that jump always paid off. Not always easy, but it's always fulfilling. Speak graciously with tact and diplomacy. Just because we've heard God's voice doesn't mean we blast everybody else with it. We hear his voice and then we speak gently and then give credit to God and others, not to yourself. So you see, in Nehemiah, we need a leader that is worth following, worth learning from. He was a visionary, a man of prayer, a real servant of God. So around our tables, let's discuss a couple of questions. What is one situation you're facing right now that you need to handle with tact and diplomacy? And what did you learn from Nehemiah today that will help you as a leader? And what role does prayer play in your leadership? And what difficulties do you face in praying?